fleece on. You got your fleece on today, John.
Yes, it is a little cooler here. And the cat gave me all the warmth she could, and
it wasn't enough, huh?
We had, about an hour ago, a very strong rainstorm with thunder and lightning.
Oh. I think it's on its way here probably, right? Doesn't this weather system, is this one coming from the coast and coming out to the desert?
I'm not sure.
The way it was swirling around, it was coming more from the south.
Oh, it was swirling from the south, huh?
And going
Oh. And where are you located again?
In San Bernardino, right in the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains.
Okay.
So.
Are you on a road that goes up to the pass or up to this Big Bear or anything?
No, this road goes up for about another dozen houses, and then just stops. So.
Well, you've got a lot of walking you could do then.
It's a small set of houses that are actually within the national forest.
Oh, really?
So, trying to get, every time we have a problem with trash delivery or something like that, there's a lot of question of, are you San Bernardino City or county, or are we on federal land? And everybody has a different answer. So, yeah, and basically everybody tells me whatever's going wrong with me is not their problem.
Right, exactly.
So
they don't cover that.
Right.
All right. Well, welcome. And if somebody's joining right now, we have a handful here, Jim and Tammy, and hi, Kathleen. I don't think you've seen our little. Can you see our little street there? I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, that's our little street. There's our group. There's Raphael over there.
Okay.
And yeah, we think Ed's on the way, and generally, and Rob. Oh, Rob said he would be here. Okay. And well, we're interested to see where you land this ship on immigration and the book of Genesis. And you gave us a nice little teaser. I thought about Jacob, and I also thought about the role of the church being somehow a pivotal role that's going to lead into the future. I think that's very exciting, rather than thinking of it being ending, and it sounds depressing. It sounds like being a pivotal role is a great place to be. So, yeah. Welcome, John, and we're interested in Dell just arrived too. Hi, Dell. Okay.
If I can get all the right windows open at once.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Computer.
I'm going to actually get mine. Keep going. I got to get my pencil and paper to take notes.
Okay. So though I promise we will spend a lot of time in Genesis. I want to start in Deuteronomy for just a moment. Deuteronomy is only a few books later. It sounds very different than Genesis. In Deuteronomy and Leviticus and other books around them have a whole lot of priestly instruction. It's like a seminary textbook for people wanting to be pastors. And it gets down into a lot of details. And so this is in Deuteronomy 26. There's a description of a worship service and how to organize it. A worship service for when the Israelites come across the Jordan into the land of Palestine. So here's instructions on a worship service that was only held once. But but we still have the written instructions for it. You shall take some of the first fruit of all the fruit of the ground that you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket, and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for God's name. And then you go to the priest who's in the office at the time and say to him, today I declare to the Lord your God that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our ancestors to give us. So you've got the call and response, all the questions and answers, just like our Presbyterian Book of Order sets forth for us to do. I was, let's see, the last few months I've been at receiving new members and installing new officers, and it's all spelled out. Mm-hmm. I say this, they say that. I ask this, they say I do, except for the places where they say I will, and once where they say I do and I will. So everything's spelled out. And when the priest takes the basket from your hand and sets it down before the altar of the Lord your God, this is the basket with the fruit that's the first things that have been picked and the first ripe fruit you've seen in years. When the priest sets it down before the altar, here is the response you shall make before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt. He lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us immigrants, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, with signs and wonders. And there's actually quite a number more verses that you need to say before you get to all start eating some of this first batch of good food. And one of the things I learned long ago about prayers before meals for gatherings in church is that the longer you go, the less people are listening and the more they're just smelling the food. But so a lot of people only remember the first line of this, which in my mind is enough. Our father was a wandering Aramean. That seems to be, according to scholars, one of the oldest passages in Scripture, one of the oldest remembrances. And a little confusing, because if you read Genesis clearly, none of our ancestors was Aramean. A lot of the ancestors wandered. I mean, Abraham was nomadic all his life and lived in different parts of Israel from time to time, and the first time he bought a piece of property, it was so that he could be buried. Abraham was a wanderer, but he actually came from Babylon, not Aramea. Aramea is just kind of a general term for some of these areas around the parts of Palestine or Israel where these people lived. Abraham had two sons. Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was rejected because he had an Egyptian mother. And Abraham thought he left Ishmael for dead. God rescued Ishmael and stayed around as the man in the house and raised Ishmael. That's a fascinating story for next time on Genesis. Isaac was clearly Daddy's favorite boy, but once Abraham heard a voice saying, "Take Isaac, go up a mountain and sacrifice him, kill him on an altar." And Abraham starts to do those things, and at the very last moment, as his hand is raised with the knife over his son Isaac, an angel appears out of nowhere and holds Abraham's hand and tells him not to do it. And we're told in the chapter at the beginning, this is a test. And Abraham, I think, the Ten Commandments hadn't come around yet, but I think everyone knew not to kill your own son. And God had repeatedly told Abraham that there will be nations counted in the name of your son. And how do you do that if you kill the kid off as a teenager? And so Abraham responded to what he thought was the voice of God, but it was inconsistent with what God had been telling Abraham and everyone else in public. After that, when Abraham walks down that mountain that he and his son Isaac had climbed up hand in hand, Abraham is alone. He never sees Isaac again in his life. And in fact, Abraham doesn't go back to his wife Sarah. Never speaks to her again. She dies about 40 years later. That whole family's been broken because Abraham failed to recognize how to do God's will by keeping Isaac alive. But Isaac didn't go to Aramea and didn't wander. He moved on. He didn't contact his father again. He wasn't a wanderer. He settled down. So trying to find the identity of this wandering Aramean. Isaac I'm looking for Genesis 25. When Isaac was 40, he married Rebekah. This is Genesis 25, verse 20. He married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, because he's from Paddan Aram. And also she is the sister of Laban the Aramean. So Isaac wasn't an Aramean, but he married into a family of Arameans. when Rebecca became pregnant, it was a struggle. And as she prayed about it, God said, you're having a struggle because there are two different nations in your womb. And they're going to be fighting their whole lives. And they started early. And sure enough, when she gave birth, there were twins. The first came out with his body already covered with hair. And it was red hair. And so they called him Esau, which is the word for red. And afterwards, the next brother was named Jacob. And Jacob is from a Hebrew word that means grasp, hold on to. The story is he had grasped onto his brother's foot and came out of the womb holding on. Not only does God provide this prophecy that Esau and Jacob are going to be at war with each other, but the kids look different from the start. Esau liked to go hunting. Jacob was a quiet man who lived in his tent. And Isaac loved Esau because Isaac was fond of wild meat. And Rebekah loved Jacob. So having twins split the parents against the kids and against each other. But remember, Rebekah is an Aramean. And this story goes on. Isaac doesn't get along well with his father. And then Esau goes and marries into the Hittites, who were not a very well respected people with very different customs. And Rebekah gets concerned for Isaac. He's shy, he stays at home. There's not many places to meet potential partners. And any girl he was dating and brought home to a father who hated him, is maybe not the best start anyway. So Mom, Rebekah, tells Isaac to get out of town, leave the parents behind, and go and stay with her brother, Laban the Aramean. So while living with Laban, his uncle, Jacob falls in love with one of his cousins. It's a long, complicated story, but Laban first cons him into agreeing to 7 years of hard labor before he can allow the marriage. And then on the day of the wedding, switches and puts the older sister in place. So So Jacob has to work another 7 years for the sister he wanted. And Laban's getting 14 years free labor out of this. Jacob eventually buys his way to freedom, becomes a nomad with a nice set of goat and sheep, 2 sister wives, and ends up with a large family. But they don't settle down for a long time. They wander about quite a bit in Aramaic. And Jacob is the wandering Aramaic. One of the first ways our ancestors in faith identified themselves was not by saying, our father is Abraham, who was a wealthy man who came from the richest country on earth, right out of Iraq and the rich places between the rivers, and he traveled to Palestine and founded a new country for us. That all would have been true, but that's not the way they chose to remember it. They chose to remember it by Abraham's grandson, whom he never met, because Abraham had not had any connections with his own family after he tried to kill Isaac when Isaac was a teenager. So certainly never met Isaac's son, Jacob. And God made this promise to Abraham that your family would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And they will know that the blessing comes from you. That it is in your name that you will become a great nation. The nation of Abraham never existed. The people never went back and called themselves the children of Isaac. The wandering Aramean, the one who got kicked out of his own house for tricking his brother, he's the one who's our ancestor. And not only a wandering Aramean, but eventually ended up living in Egypt. Moved to a whole different continent. He wandered so much. And that becomes the image, the touchstone, the heart of Israelite identity. We come from a nation, a family of wanderers. And we never really had a home. Oh, yeah, many of us had a home for a while. Some of us were just nomads all the way through. But we remember ourselves because of Jacob as wandering Arameans with not much claim to a land, not going to be here very long. We are living as perpetual immigrants. Even when the whole family relocates down to to Egypt at the end of Genesis, where they can get enough to eat during a time when the whole world is in famine, there in Egypt, they make homes for a while. But the way the story goes, it's only one page before the slavery hits, and God starts to plan to how to get them out. And when they get out, they aren't wandering in Arabia, but they're wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. So another generation of wandering. Moses is one of those key wanderers. When Moses Moses seems to have gone through 4 parts of his life. About 40 years living, since he had been kind of adopted as Pharaoh's daughter, he spent 40 years growing up in the temple, in the palace of Pharaoh, learning how to be an Egyptian. But it didn't stick. Moses did in his youth being in his 40s, had a bit of a temper, and when he saw an Egyptian man beating an Israelite slave, he went and put an end to it by killing the Egyptian, which was against the law, and so he was run out of town. He became an immigrant in Midian, though he's a convict running from the law. And he is a refugee for reasons of his own making. Moses then spent about 40 years farming in an area known as Midian, a little off to the side of Egypt, a little more into the Saudi Arabia side. He marries a Midianite woman. Her father moves in with them and teaches Moses almost everything he knows about farming and about running human communities. And his father-in-law, Jethro, who had been a judge, knew that no matter how well organized you are, how many good intentions there will always be conflicts in human societies. And somebody needs to step in and provide some justice. Hopefully not doing the way that Moses learned to do it in his 40s, but now, as he's gotten into his 80s, he's mellowed out some. He's maybe just not as quick with a sword as he used to be. And it's at 80 when he sees a bush burn and gets a call from God to go back to Egypt, where he is still a wanted fugitive, and go to the new Pharaoh and ask for permission for all the slaves to go free. Whether it's Jacob, the wandering Aramean, or Moses, the wandering Midianite, Israelite by birth, Egyptian by upraising, and spent the last 40 years of his life wandering in the wilderness. We have these leaders, the people who give our movement meaning and identity, who are wanderers. We talked earlier, Jesus was a wanderer. He explains, even foxes have dens to live in, but I don't have any place to lay my head. I can't see any place in the gospel where Jesus spends more than 2 or 3 nights in the same place. Then he's on to another city. He is wandering. Sometimes he just gets on a boat with friends, and wherever they land is where he goes next. Other times he has more of a purpose. And especially when in the middle of the Gospels he sets, and this is relevant as we move from Ash Wednesday into Lent, and we start retracing some of Jesus' journey It's in the middle of the Gospels where he sets his sights on Jerusalem. And he's not even in the same country, but he's going to walk pretty much in a straight line until he gets there in time for Maundy Thursday. But he is still a wanderer. And keeps moving. Paul is a wanderer who keeps, there's one passage where Paul explains what a wonderful upbringing he had, and then was sent to the world's finest universities in different continents for short stays, and then has been in this city and that city. He founded this church and a few others. He was working in Turkey, he was working in Greece, he was working in Palestine, and never stayed long. He's the only one of these people who took boats to get to new places. And from what we can see in the biblical record, there are a couple of times he spent up to 2 years in one place in his adult life, but never more than that. Some of the places he stayed longest, he did because he was in prison, and it would take him a year or two to figure out how to escape. But he was eager to go back to being a wanderer. And this is one step further than all of the pro-immigration stances we've heard before. And this is from Jacob to Moses to Jesus to Paul. These are people who chose to be wanderers, who chose the lives of immigrants, of perpetual immigrants, always moving, always changing. And this is the leadership tradition in our faith. That our father was a wandering Aramean, and when it comes down to it, most of our great leaders moved around. I don't know if your congregation there spends a lot of time, as some Presbyterian churches do, talking about John Calvin and his life and work and writings. No. He did write, well, there are about 40 or 50 of the books he wrote in one decade that are most famous. Some people feel that he was too short-tempered and he didn't get along, and he insisted on everybody understanding it his way or not at all. But we need to understand Calvin a bit differently, I think. Calvin was a wanderer. He was a wanderer across from France into Switzerland, into parts of Germany during days of civil war in those places. He got a big city church for about 15 months and then left because there was a group of French-speaking refugees who were huddled in refugee camps, and he went to live among them and minister among them. Eventually, the big city said, "We need you back as our pastor." And he said, "Well, the leaders of the town can't appoint a pastor. So they elected him as mayor and sent the local police force out saying, we've also made a law it's illegal for the mayor to live outside the city. So he becomes mayor, which is a worse job than pastor, and gets into all sorts of trouble, and eventually they run him out of town as mayor with a penalty of death chasing him. So he can go back to his immigrant ministry. In a time where no one wrote religious instruction in any language but Latin, he started writing in Latin, and then when he got to his immigrant church, he said, no, I'm going to translate all that. From now on, I write in French, because it's in French that I'm teaching these refugees and immigrants. He was willing to change his language of his sermons and his teaching to be the language of immigrants, and to be known as a champion of these people who were homeless, destitute, regarded as a political liability by every country around them. And by insisting that immigrants are part of the church, insisting that cities treat immigrants fairly and make sure they have enough to eat, and creating the underground pipelines that would keep these immigrants well fed and safe. He was also eventually sentenced to death and spent most of the last years of his life on the run from the law. If we were to read the Bible seriously and know our history in Calvin, or some of the history with Luther or a number of others since, we would regard that the best thing to have on your resume if you're looking to be pastor is, I'm on the run from the law. And churches would be saying, non-convicts need not apply. We have been, for 3,000 years and more, a risk-taking people. And we will defy any government, even at the risk of our own lives, to stand up for immigrants. We want to be remembered as immigrants, as people on the move, as people on the run. And even at the end of Scripture, to get to the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation is written about a time when the Roman Empire was strong and didn't want anyone to disagree. And so a lot of early Christians were being killed. Paul himself had been taking up offerings to feed widows and orphans and other starving people in the Christian church. And especially took up offerings for people in other parts of the world who were immigrants there and in need. And then he would arrange for the food and clothes and money to be sent internationally at great risk. That meant that he was wanted by the international police for smuggling, for moving goods illegally across borders. Our translations in the book of Acts just make it all nice and sweet. Mom and Pop took an offering and sent a few pennies and kind of mailed it down to those other Christians somewhere else, and then they could eat and everyone lived happily ever after. But they were guilty of international law for raising the money and for sending it across borders. And the people who received it and ate the food were guilty of receiving aid from a foreign country. We leave most of that out of the translation, or at least the one that King James wanted us to write. And so, in Revelation, people have been experiencing the persecution of governments because the Christian community is breaking down barriers. Jews and Greeks will raise money together to feed Jewish orphans and widows and Greek orphans and widows across national lines. That was illegal, and it got them killed. A lot of the martyrs of the early church were killed for breaking the laws of helping immigrants and helping people from other countries and sneaking people across borders. And in the book of Revelation, it tells about a time in heaven when all these martyrs come back to life. And they're a motley crew from all over the world. They don't speak the same language. The only word they can say together is hallelujah, and point at the glory of God who can bring them together even beyond earth into one people. And God says what happens in heaven needs to happen down here on earth. So God creates a new Jerusalem, a beautiful, shiny place with everything you would ever want, and sends it down to earth and invites all of the people to come. All they have to do is leave the empire. And since the empire wants them dead, they're motivated to immigrate. Everyone who lives in the New Jerusalem is an immigrant. That's the only way you get in, is being willing to live in a city where everyone is an immigrant. And so we go from having a few people who are wanderers to having a long list of leaders who wander, who are refugees from a law that tells you not to share. They can take pride in the fact they're still obeying the underlying law of God, which is there is one law for citizen and immigrant alike. And they just refuse to live and obey the law in any country that won't agree. And so everyone immigrates to the New Jerusalem to be there with God and with people from all over the world, speaking every tongue imaginable, learning to live as one community of God's people. Every one of those have left behind a home. And when they get there, God hands each one of them a rock with their new name. Because when you're an immigrant and you move to a country with a new language, so often you get a new name. So many of us grew up with names that recognize a relative, grandmother or grandfather. My name, John, came because that was my grandfather's brother's name. And my grandfather wanted an heir who would remember how much his brother meant to him. Our names have 1,000, a million different stories, but many of them tie back to where we used to be, what we used to do. And God gives each one of us a new name in a new language that will bring us together. And a name that will write our future for us, not a name written in our past. And the only future we have is when we have one law for citizens and immigrants alike that say we are all immigrants here and we are all citizens. These are our people. They come from all over the world. But God has brought us all together at last. That is the hope we're moving toward. Every time we are kind and gracious to one immigrant with one piece of food or one night of housing, we are walking closer to the New Jerusalem. We are beginning to learn the habits that we need if we're all going to live in God's kingdom peaceably together. And when we give up our attachments to our own homes and move into God's new city and declare ourselves citizens there, following the law of God alone, we will all be immigrants together, and it will be God's joyful, perfect world. We do what we can every day by living with one law, by being kind to immigrants. Christianity's not always lived up to that. We like being settled people. We even have this crazy habit of calling our long-term pastors installed, as if they were hammered and nailed into that very building and are now just part of the furniture. We like our sanctuaries. We like our great big buildings. And it's only a brave person who can walk out of that and find another place that's temporary. Our only permanence has never come from our buildings. It has always come from God. Almost every church that Paul started, closed a couple thousand years ago. And Paul was very good at church starting and all those things, but could never make a permanent church. You cannot have a permanent church if God is the only permanent thing in our lives. I'm glad we have places we can be together for a time. Very glad for those places in my own life and own history that have been safe and home and sanctuary and church building. Most of the places where I have worshiped, where I have attended, I still think of myself as pretty young. Most of those places no longer stand. The church where I was baptized no longer stands. The church I knew in high school no longer stands. Those were all wonderful places where God found me. but they're not permanent, because only God is. And so God needs all of us to become immigrants, not just show compassion to immigrants, but to change our names and say that our father was a wanderer, our Savior was a wanderer. Our laws come from a nation of nomads, people who were not welcome in any civilized country. That's how we make the biblical story our own, and how we know what God has waiting for us. Grounded in God's own permanence, grounded in the size of our family, because it's everyone who's ever been an immigrant called together into one place. That vision in Revelation is world-changing. And we're not there yet. I still like to have other buildings for the moment. But I know that God is the one who loves me permanently. And God loves you permanently. And so whatever differences of law or of geography or of habit or custom or language there are that keep me and you apart will need to disappear for us to be truly God's family. Those who are currently seeing themselves as wanderers, as migrants, as homeless, may well be one step closer to that than I am. Which is why we need to go to them and ask for their help. Not just offer them charity, but offer their help in learning how we can be one people, not just residents, but all of us immigrants, all of us wanderers. This is not quite the entirety of things I could say about Genesis. I left out some really interesting characters. And the Bible has a lot more stories about immigration and how it can go well and how it can be a painful mess. And how hard it has been for thousands of years to just live with one law for everyone. But I'm glad we've had the time to talk about some of these people from Genesis and some of their migrations, and hear that every time God calls us further, it is a step toward a heavenly city where none of us were born, and none of us belongs there any more than anyone else, and where we will practice one law for residents and immigrants alike, because we know we're immigrants in God's place. I can stay around for a couple questions.
Well, I hope you will. Good. So I'll just respond to one thing. I mean, I really enjoy looking at the scripture very differently and looking at the task of bringing transformation in the world in a very different way through this immigration. So thank you for that. And also, just personally, so you're talking about different people, how we're going to a city where we've never been born. It's interesting that's we're always trying to get back to where we were, to our home. And it was interesting. My wife is from the Covenant Church family, and Swedish Covenant, and her father was the first Swedish covenant minister that wasn't Swedish. His name was Wiganowski. And he used to get it all the time. Like we'd go to conferences, and they'd always call out Roger Wiganowski, and they kind of actually liked it, that he sort of broke the mold of how they always were, just ethnically centered, and and he always had a very heart and compassion for people that were of a different ethnic than the other people in the church. So I always liked that. I didn't go covenant because it was still too Swedish covenant for me. I didn't think I could fit in. But, so, thank you. Okay, other comments or questions from people out there? You can come sit here and ask a question, Dale.
Well, it's not exactly. I have a story to tell.
Well, there you go. I had a story too. You have to listen to our stories. Mine first.
I happened to say to someone with a different, totally different viewpoint of the Christian life, that Jesus was a homeless immigrant. And boy, wow. Oh, the reaction I got to that was really something. That's that new interpretation just to excuse all the people invading our country, kind of thing. And then later on, she came to me and she said, I think the reason my reaction was so extreme was, and she went into a long explanation, but her summation was that because Jesus knew where his home was and who his father was, it changed the whole attitude. And if our homeless people could know God, they would have a whole different way of looking at life, and life wouldn't be so homeless, and they wouldn't need the drugs and the horrible things that are happening. I thought it was a very interesting way of summing it up. Anyway,
Yeah.
I wanted to share that with everybody because it really, was kind of shocking.
Yeah, these are very current issues, and to realize that for every Bible character, they were facing their own specific situations of immigration or fear of immigrants or tricky laws that favored some and not others. It's not just immigration as a social issue that divides people now. This is what everyone in the Bible is living through.
I also need to inform everybody here that while this has been going on, we have a new woman occupying our front porch, the shelter of where we are here, who has no other home. She's wearing a blanket over her head and down over her, probably because, we've had quite a bit of rain and it's cold out there.
Yeah.
So we have our own concerns and people, we need to figure out how to deal with them and how to help them.
Not only that, but I liked what you said about having them help us, because if here's somebody who's living on the street, they might have learned some things that they might have an immigrant attitude that we could learn from. We could, get some smarts on how to live that way too, how to be more open to living a day at a time and without all the trappings that we have without a home. So it's interesting. Yeah, I think I've met her several times. I'll go.
I think
chat
it
with
is
her.
the same
Yeah,
woman
we'll
who's
chat
been
with
here
her.
frequently.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well,
I may be closer than a lot of people to dealing with this since I've lived in over 50 homes in 8 states and 2 foreign countries.
That's good.
But
You've learned a lot.
But I do have a lot of baggage.
You mean you have a lot of things? Is that what you mean?
Well,
Or you mean like emotional baggage, or you mean like real
No,
baggage?
no.
Real baggage.
stuff.
Yeah,
stuff,
okay, I
you know.
gotcha, got it.
You know, I like the comforts of modern life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Del. Anybody else have a comment? Jim? Would you comment? We'll sit right here. Have you, well, you're going to meet Jim right now if you haven't met him before.
No.
Jim, John,
We
John,
haven't
Jim.
met.
Hi, Jerry.
I'm a United Methodist who, when I retired and so forth, the little church was about 5 or 6 houses from ours, and that was a lot more comfortable than anything else. So that's where I'm at this point. But the comment was similar to that John Wesley, both Wesleys, Charles and John, certainly fit in that paradigm that you've been talking about very, very well. And that's basically the definition of what it is to be a Methodist preacher yet today, to be, we call it itineracy, and the bishop has that ability to work with his select group to find the best place and to be continually sending the ministers out into a new area, to be immigrants into that area and take it. And that's what he did in a lot of new areas. So that was pretty interesting. These here know that my graduate degree was in then church history, so I worked with, and in fact, I learned a few things because I did it at CGU, and Jane Douglas was one of my good teachers in that, and that time back there in the 70s and very early 80s, as I finished up. She was still around before she went back to Princeton, and that's so. When your thing about the early, many of the early martyrs being condemned for being helpful to immigrants gave me a whole new thing to try and look at in the early church history, because that's not a way that I had ever considered that part of history. I didn't see that. I knew that they were immigrants and moving around, and you can see it in Paul very easily, but and where they spread out. But the idea that for treating others fairly, whether they're immigrants or not, I hadn't ever done that. So that'll be an interesting area of study here, if I get around to doing that. I've given away most of my books and a few other things at this point.
Yeah. Jenny, who's been kind of a long-term friend of our family, retired to Claremont.
Yes, oh yeah, I've seen her since she moved back.
Okay.
A couple times.
Yeah.
Actually, I was in American church history. I started out in patristics, and Muhlenberg moved away. At that time, the School of Theology was having, one of the many times they were having financial problems, and he went on sabbatical and never came home. And my choice was to...
He's a hero.
Yeah.
Well, he went back to Germany. He'd immigrated here.
Traitor.
But anyway, so I ended up in American church history, so it's a little bit different than all of that. But I hadn't heard I didn't really know anything about Calvin. I stayed away from Calvin.
Me too. And I'm Presbyterian. I stayed away from. That's the most interesting description of Calvin I've ever heard. So thank you for presenting that.
No. I just wanted to say that the whole paradigm does fit so many, I think, of the church here. And certainly, it helps explain a lot of American church history throughout the 19th century. That's the way we saw ourselves very much, and we did some bad things with all of that in terms of environment and the natives that were here and others, but it helps explain a lot.
Yeah.
Good
to meet you.
I'm hoping Jim will be willing to, yeah, we're trying to think how we could have him kind of move this into church history. And it's interesting how we got to where we are, because we're very much a settled church now, very much a settled church. I mean, the worst thing that could ever happen is that you somehow would, your church would go away. It would be like people would just be devastated, right, if their church went away. But it sounds like that's pretty much, it's eventually going to happen to everybody, right? The new city's coming, and that's where we're going to live, not in our old churches. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts? Well, Jim, John, we thank you very much for coming and being a part of our group for 6 times, and we'd love to have you in person sometime. I don't know how that could be, but it'd be nice to have a reunion sometime. Maybe we can immigrate out there even, and somehow be out there. That might be a way of doing it too. Huh? And have Sally, you mean, yes, yeah, and hey, Sally be there, yeah, all that.
Yeah.
Well, how about if I, go ahead.
Sally and I are sometimes in the same place, but there are so many people who've never seen us both at the same time. And so, yeah, this is, someday we will figure out a way to both be together in some of these places we've both learned to love.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the cat today.
Yeah, the cat isn't with him today, right? Is the cat down below, or where's the cat?
This was my second Zoom meeting in a row, and the cat was all over the first one and got tired.
Okay.
So she's at my feet.
All right. Well, let me offer prayer for you and our church, the church at large. Lord, thank you for John and the message of immigration that is so pervasive in the scripture and yet so unseen. And thank you for reminding us of our status as being wanderers and our call to be to treat all people with immigrant or citizen with one law, and to be sensitive to the immigrants around us and to learn from them. So thank you for this new message. It's not new, but it's kind of new to the church today. And bless John and Sally and their endeavors, and thank you that they've reached out to so many different people. In your mercy, Lord, hear our prayer. All right. Thank you very much, John. We really appreciate it. This is very big.
I'll look forward to the next thing we can do together, and if it's in person, all the better. So.
Okay. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
I'll let you see them. There they are. Bye-bye. Okay.